The scent of pine and wood smoke hit Aurora Miller's face before she even saw the cabin through the snow, and she knew this was either salvation or the end of everything she had been running from for 3 long weeks. Her hands shook as she raised them to knock on the rough-hewn door, her knuckles so cold she could barely feel them connect with the wood. The sound echoed through the Montana mountains like a gunshot in the January silence of 1884, and for a moment she wondered if she should have stayed hidden in the trees, if knocking had been a terrible mistake that would cost her the last shred of safety she might have found. The door opened with such sudden force that Aurora stumbled backward, her worn boots sliding on the icy porch. The man who filled the doorway was unlike anyone she had ever seen in her 22 years of living. He stood well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and solid as the mountain itself, with dark hair that fell past his collar and a thick beard that concealed most of his face. His eyes were what caught her breath, though, pale blue like winter ice, and they studied her with a mixture of suspicion and something else she could not quite name. "Please," Aurora heard herself whisper, the word coming out like a prayer. "I need help." Xavier Crawford had not seen another human being in 4 months, not since he had made his last trip down to the settlement of Virginia City to trade furs for supplies. He had chosen this isolated existence deliberately, building his cabin high in the Tobacco Root Mountains where no one would find him, where no one would ask questions about his past or try to draw him back into a world he wanted no part of anymore. The woman on his porch looked half-frozen, her dark hair matted with snow, her green eyes enormous in a face that was too pale, too thin. She wore a dress that might have once been fine but was now torn and dirty, and she had no coat despite the brutal cold. "Where did you come from?" Xavier's voice came out rougher than he intended, rusty from disuse. "Ellsworth," Aurora said, though that was not entirely true. She had been in Ellsworth, Kansas, 3 weeks ago, but her journey had started much earlier than that. "My stagecoach was attacked. I ran. I have been walking for days." Xavier's eyes narrowed. Ellsworth was more than 1,000 miles from where they stood. No stagecoach route ran anywhere near these mountains. The woman was lying, but she was also clearly desperate and freezing to death on his porch. He had spent 5 years building walls around his heart, determined never to let anyone in again after what had happened in the war and after. But looking at this woman's trembling form, he found himself stepping back and gesturing inside. "Get in before you freeze," he said curtly. Aurora did not need to be told twice. She stumbled into the cabin's warmth, and the sudden temperature change made her head spin. She would have fallen if Xavier had not caught her arm, his large hand steady and surprisingly gentle. He guided her to a chair near the fireplace and wrapped a heavy blanket around her shoulders. "Thank you," she managed to say through chattering teeth. "Thank you so much." Xavier did not respond. He moved to the stove and poured something hot from a pot into a tin cup, then brought it to her. "Drink this. It is just broth, but it will warm you." Aurora took the cup with both hands, barely feeling the heat through her numb fingers. She sipped carefully, and the warm liquid seemed to spread life back through her frozen body. Xavier stood watching her, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his expression unreadable. The cabin was larger than it had seemed from outside. One big room with a sleeping area in one corner, a kitchen area with a cast iron stove in another, and a sturdy table with 2 chairs near the fireplace. Furs and skins hung on the walls, and the place was surprisingly neat and well kept. It smelled of wood and leather and something wild that Aurora could not identify. "What is your real story?" Xavier asked after several minutes of silence. "And do not lie to me again." Aurora looked up at him, startled. She had thought her lie was believable enough, but apparently this mountain man was sharper than she had hoped. She took another sip of broth, buying herself time to think. She could run again, but she had nowhere to go and night was falling fast. She could keep lying, but something in those ice-blue eyes told her he would see through whatever she said. So she decided on a version of the truth. "My father died 6 months ago," she began slowly. "He owned a ranch outside of Dodge City, Kansas. When he died, a man named Silas Trent claimed my father owed him money, a substantial debt. He said he would forgive the debt if I married him." She paused, her hands tightening on the cup. "Silas Trent is 53 years old and has buried 2 wives already. I refused. He got a judge to rule in his favor anyway, said my father's debt transferred to me as his only heir. They were going to force me to marry him or take the ranch and everything I owned." "So you ran," Xavier said. "It was not a question." "I ran," Aurora confirmed. "I took what money I could find and bought passage on a stage heading west. I thought maybe I could disappear in California, start over somewhere he would never find me. But Silas sent men after me. They caught up to the stage outside of Virginia City 4 days ago." She looked down at her hands. "They killed the driver and the other passenger, a merchant from Helena. I managed to get away during the shooting. I took a horse and rode as far as I could before it threw me. After that, I walked. I found your cabin this afternoon." Xavier was quiet for a long moment, processing her story. He could hear the truth in it now, could see the genuine fear in her eyes. He understood running, understood wanting to escape a life that felt like a trap. But he also understood that taking her in meant trouble, meant that eventually those men would come looking, meant his isolation would be shattered. "Those men," he said finally. "How many?" "3," Aurora replied. "At least 3 were on the stage. I do not know if Silas sent more." "And you think you lost them?" "I do not know," she admitted. "I tried to cover my tracks, but I am not very skilled at that sort of thing. The snow might have hidden my trail." Xavier turned away and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening forest. Snow was falling again, thick and heavy. If the woman's pursuers were out there, they would have to hole up for the night, same as anyone else. This high in the mountains in January, being caught outside after dark was a death sentence. "You can stay tonight," he said without turning around. "Tomorrow we will figure out what comes next." Relief flooded through Aurora so intensely she felt tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you. I promise I will not be any trouble. I can work. I can help with whatever you need. I know how to cook and clean and mend. I can earn my keep." "We will talk about it tomorrow," Xavier said, his voice still rough and distant. "Right now you need to eat something more substantial and get warm. When did you last have a real meal?" Aurora had to think about it. 2 days ago, maybe 3. "I found some berries yesterday, but they were frozen and bitter." Xavier shook his head and moved to the kitchen area. He began pulling out supplies, and within a few minutes he had bacon sizzling in a pan and was slicing bread from a loaf that looked homemade. Aurora watched him work, fascinated by how efficient and capable he was in his own space. His movements were economical, no wasted motion, like a man who had lived alone for a very long time and knew exactly how to take care of himself. When he brought her a plate piled with food, Aurora's stomach growled loudly enough that they both heard it. Xavier's expression did not change, but she thought she saw the faintest hint of something that might have been amusement in his eyes. "Eat slowly," he instructed. "Your stomach is not used to much food right now." Aurora tried to follow his advice, but the bacon was crispy and salty, and the bread was fresh and good, and she found herself eating faster than she should have. Xavier sat across from her with his own plate, eating in silence. She snuck glances at him between bites, trying to figure out what kind of man he was. He was younger than she had first thought, probably not much past 30. The beard and the rough mountain life had aged him, but when she looked closer, she could see he had a strong, handsome face beneath all that hair. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked when she had finished eating. 5 years, Xavier replied. "Maybe closer to 6 now." "Alone the whole time?" "Yes. That must be lonely." Xavier's eyes flicked up to meet hers, and for a moment she saw something raw and painful in them before his expression closed again. "I prefer it that way." Aurora wanted to ask more, wanted to understand why someone would choose such complete isolation, but she could tell from his tone that the subject was closed. Instead, she looked around the cabin again, noticing details she had missed before. There were books on a shelf near the bed, quite a few of them, which surprised her. There was also a fiddle hanging on the wall, well cared for and polished. "You play?" she asked, nodding toward the instrument. Xavier glanced at the fiddle and something softened in his face for just a moment. "Used to, not much anymore." "I would like to hear it sometime," Aurora said softly. "Music seems like it would be a comfort in a place like this." Xavier did not respond to that. Instead, he stood and took their plates to a basin, where he washed them with the same efficient movements he did everything else. Aurora watched him, feeling suddenly exhausted as the warmth and food finally caught up with her. Her eyes grew heavy, and she had to fight to keep them open. "You take the bed," Xavier said, noticing her fatigue. "I will sleep by the fire." "I could not," Aurora protested. "This is your home. I will take the floor." "You are half frozen and exhausted," Xavier said firmly. "You need the bed more than I do." "I have slept on worse than a warm floor, believe me." Aurora wanted to argue further, but she was so tired she could barely think straight. She nodded and stood, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Xavier pulled back the thick furs that covered his bed, revealing clean sheets beneath. For a mountain man living alone, he kept a remarkably tidy home. "Thank you," Aurora said again, her voice small, "for everything. I know I am disrupting your life, and I am grateful you did not just turn me away." Xavier looked at her for a long moment, and Aurora had the strange sensation that he was seeing right through her, seeing every secret and fear she carried. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "Tomorrow will come soon enough." Aurora climbed into the bed, and the moment her head hit the pillow, she was asleep. Xavier stood watching her for a moment, this unexpected woman who had appeared on his doorstep like something out of a dream or a nightmare. He was not yet sure which. He could already feel the walls he had built around his heart starting to crack, and it frightened him more than he wanted to admit. He settled himself by the fire with a few furs for warmth and stared into the flames, thinking about the past he had tried so hard to leave behind. The war had taken everything from him: his innocence, his faith in humanity, his ability to trust. Afterward, he had tried to return to normal life, had even gotten engaged to a woman back in Missouri. But she had taken one look at the man who came back from the war and realized he was not the same person she had fallen in love with. She married his brother instead, 3 months after Xavier came home. That was when he had decided to disappear into the mountains, to leave behind everything and everyone, to become someone new or maybe no one at all. For 5 years it had worked. He had found a kind of peace in the solitude, in the rhythm of trapping and hunting and surviving. He had convinced himself he did not need anyone, that he was better off alone. But now there was a woman sleeping in his bed, a woman running from her own demons, and Xavier could feel something shifting inside him that he did not know how to stop. The next morning, Aurora woke to the smell of coffee and frying eggs. For a disoriented moment, she could not remember where she was, and panic seized her. Then she saw Xavier standing at the stove, his back to her, and everything came flooding back. She was safe, at least for now. She sat up slowly, her body aching in a dozen places from her ordeal. Xavier heard her movement and glanced over his shoulder. "There is water heating if you want to wash," he said, gesturing to a pot on the stove. "And I left some clean clothes on the chair for you. They will be too big, but they are better than what you are wearing." Aurora looked down at herself and realized she was still in her torn, dirty dress. She must have been so exhausted last night that she had fallen asleep in her clothes. "Thank you," she said, climbing out of bed. Her legs were stiff and sore, but they held her weight. Xavier handed her a towel and a cake of soap, then turned his back to give her privacy as she washed. The warm water felt like heaven on her skin, washing away days of grime and fear. The clothes he had left were a simple cotton shirt and a pair of trousers that she had to roll up at the ankles and cinch tight at the waist with a belt. But they were clean and warm and infinitely better than her ruined dress. When she was dressed, Xavier set a plate of eggs and more of that good bread in front of her, along with a steaming cup of coffee. Aurora ate more slowly this morning, mindful of his advice from the night before. Xavier sat across from her with his own breakfast, and they ate in companionable silence. "I have been thinking," Xavier said when they had both finished eating, "about your situation." Aurora's heart began to race. Was he going to tell her she had to leave? Yes. "Those men will keep looking for you," Xavier said. "Even if they lost your trail, they will keep searching. Men like that do not give up easily, especially if they are being paid." "I know," Aurora said quietly. "That is why I need to keep moving. I will leave today if you can just point me toward the nearest town." "The nearest town is Virginia City, and it is a hard 2-day journey from here, longer in this snow," Xavier said. "And if you go there, those men will find you. It is where they last saw you, so they will be watching it." "Then what do you suggest?" Aurora asked, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. Xavier was quiet for a moment, and Aurora could tell he was weighing something heavy in his mind. Finally, he spoke. "You stay here, for the winter at least. By spring, this Silas Trent might have given up, or you might have figured out a better plan. Up here, no one will find you. I barely go to town myself, and when I do, it is only to trade furs. You will be safe." Aurora stared at him in shock. "You would let me stay, for months?" "I would," Xavier said, though his expression was guarded. "But there are conditions. You pull your weight. You help with the work around here, the cooking and the cleaning and whatever else needs doing. And you understand that come spring, you need to have a plan for what comes next. I am offering you shelter and safety, not a permanent home." Aurora felt tears welling up in her eyes again, and this time she could not stop them from spilling over. "I will work hard, I promise. I will do anything you need. You will not regret this." Xavier looked uncomfortable with her tears. "Do not cry," he said gruffly. "It is just common decency, nothing more." But Aurora could see that it was more than that. This man, this isolated mountain man who had chosen to live alone for 5 years, was taking a risk by letting her stay. He was opening his door and at least a small part of his carefully guarded heart, even if he did not want to admit it. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised both of them with how natural it felt. Aurora proved to be as good as her word about working hard. She took over the cooking, which Xavier was secretly grateful for since his own meals had been purely functional for years. She discovered he had a small root cellar stocked with potatoes, carrots, onions, and other vegetables he had grown the previous summer, and she began making meals that were actually flavorful and varied. She cleaned and organized the cabin, mended his clothes, and even figured out how to make soap from animal fat and lye. In return, Xavier taught her how to prepare animal hides, how to set snares for rabbits, and how to read the weather in the mountains. He showed her which plants were safe to eat and which would kill her, how to start a fire in the snow, and how to move quietly through the forest. They talked more as the days passed, though Xavier was still guarded about his past. Aurora told him about growing up on her father's ranch, about learning to ride before she could read, about her mother who had died when Aurora was 12. She talked about her father, who had been gruff but loving, and how devastated she had been when he died suddenly of a heart attack. "He was only 52, she said one evening as they sat by the fire. "He should have had years left. I was not ready to lose him." "No one is ever ready," Xavier said quietly. "Death does not wait for us to be prepared." "Did you lose someone?" Aurora asked gently. "Is that why you are up here?" Xavier was silent for so long that Aurora thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, "I lost everyone. The war took my friends, my innocence, my faith. What came after took the rest. I came up here because there was nothing left down there worth staying for." "I am sorry," Aurora whispered. "The war must have been terrible." "It was," Xavier said simply. "I was at Shiloh, at Antietam, at Gettysburg. I saw things no person should ever have to see. I did things I will never forgive myself for. When it was over, I thought I could just come home and forget, but you cannot forget something like that. It is in your bones, in your blood. The woman I was going to marry, she took one look at me and knew I was broken. She was right to choose my brother instead." "She was a fool," Aurora said with surprising fierceness. "You are not broken. You are a good man who has been through hell and survived. That takes strength, not weakness." Xavier looked at her in surprise. "You do not know me well enough to say that." "I know you could have turned me away, and you did not," Aurora said. "I know you have been nothing but kind to me, even though I am a stranger who brought trouble to your door. I know you live up here alone because you are hurting, not because you are cruel or cold. That tells me everything I need to know about what kind of man you are." Xavier felt something crack in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 5 long years. He looked at Aurora across the firelight, at her green eyes that saw too much, at her face that had filled out and gained color in the weeks she had been with him. She was beautiful, he realized with a start. Not just pretty, but genuinely beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with her features and everything to do with her spirit. "You should be careful about seeing good in people," he said roughly, trying to rebuild the walls she was so effortlessly tearing down. "It will only lead to disappointment." "Maybe," Aurora said, "but I would rather be disappointed than spend my life never trusting anyone." After that conversation, something shifted between them. Xavier found himself watching Aurora more, noticing little things about her. The way she hummed while she cooked, old songs her mother had taught her. The way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating on mending a torn shirt. The way she laughed, freely and fully, when he told her about the time a raccoon had gotten into his cabin and destroyed half his supplies. Aurora noticed changes too. Xavier smiled more, actual smiles that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. He began playing the fiddle again in the evenings, filling the cabin with music that was sometimes mournful but increasingly joyful. He talked more, sharing stories from before the war, about growing up on a farm in Missouri with 3 brothers and 2 sisters, about learning to hunt and fish from his grandfather. One morning in late February, Aurora woke to find the cabin much colder than usual. The fire had burned down to embers, and when Xavier tried to open the door to get more wood from the pile outside, it would not budge. "We are snowed in," he announced, putting his shoulder to the door. It moved a few inches before hitting a solid wall of snow. "Must have been quite a storm last night. How long will we be stuck?" Aurora asked, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Hard to say," Xavier replied. "Could be a day, could be a week. We have plenty of supplies, so we will be fine." "Just means we will be spending even more time in close quarters." He said it lightly, but Aurora heard the slight tension in his voice. They had been living together for over 2 months now, and while they had settled into a comfortable routine, there was an undercurrent of something else, something neither of them was willing to acknowledge. Being truly snowed in made that tension harder to ignore. With nothing to do but keep the fire going and pass the time, they were forced into even more proximity than usual. They played cards, using dried beans as betting chips. They took turns reading aloud from Xavier's collection of books. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing the kind of deep conversations that usually only happen in the small hours of the night. On the third day of being snowed in, Aurora was mending one of Xavier's shirts when the needle slipped and jabbed deep into her thumb. She yelped and dropped the shirt, blood welling up from the wound. Xavier was beside her in an instant, taking her hand in his. "Let me see," he said, his voice gentle. He examined the wound, then grabbed a clean cloth and wrapped it around her thumb, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. "It is not too deep. You will be fine." But he did not let go of her hand. They stayed like that for a long moment, Xavier holding Aurora's hand wrapped in the cloth, both of them suddenly acutely aware of how close they were. Aurora looked up and found Xavier staring at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Aurora," he said, her name rough in his throat. "Yes," she whispered. Xavier seemed to struggle with something, then abruptly let go of her hand and stood up. "I should check the door again, see if I can dig us out yet." Aurora watched him go, her heart pounding. She knew what had almost happened, knew that Xavier had been about to kiss her or say something that would change everything between them. She also knew he had stopped himself deliberately, had pulled back from whatever edge they were standing on. That night, Aurora lay in bed unable to sleep. Xavier was on his usual spot by the fire, but she could tell from his breathing that he was awake too. The cabin was dark except for the firelight, and the silence felt heavy with all the words they were not saying. "Xavier," she finally said into the darkness. "Yes. Why did you stop? Earlier, I mean." There was a long pause. "You know why. I want to hear you say it." Xavier sat up, his silhouette outlined by the firelight. "Because you are here temporarily. Because come spring you will move on with your life. Because I am a man who lives alone on a mountain and has nothing to offer someone like you. Because you deserve better than a broken-down soldier who has forgotten how to live in the world." Aurora sat up too, clutching the furs around her. "What if I do not want to move on come spring? What if I want to stay?" "You do not know what you are saying," Xavier said, but Aurora could hear the longing in his voice. "I am 22 years old, Xavier. I know my own mind." She climbed out of bed and walked over to where he sat, lowering herself to the floor beside him. "These past 2 months have been the happiest I have been since my father died. Maybe the happiest I have ever been. I feel safe here, not just from Sela's Trent, but safe in a deeper way. I feel like I can be myself, like I do not have to pretend or perform or be anything other than who I am." "Aurora," Xavier said, and his voice cracked on her name. "I am falling in love with you," Aurora said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I think I have been for weeks now, and I think maybe you feel the same way. Am I wrong?" Xavier looked at her, really looked at her, and Aurora saw all his walls crumbling. "No," he said hoarsely. "You are not wrong. God help me, you are not wrong." Then he was kissing her, his hands cupping her face with a gentleness that made her want to cry. Aurora kissed him back with everything in her, pouring all her feelings into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I am terrified," he admitted. "I do not know how to do this anymore. I do not know how to let someone in." "Neither do I," Aurora said. "We will figure it out together." They held each other by the fire until dawn, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. By the time the sun rose, everything had changed. The walls around Xavier's heart had finally come down, and Aurora had found the home she had been searching for without even realizing it. When Xavier finally managed to dig them out 2 days later, the world outside was transformed by snow into something magical and pristine. Aurora stood on the porch breathing in the cold, clean air, feeling like she was seeing everything with new eyes. Xavier came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "Beautiful, is it not?" he said, his breath warm against her ear. "It is perfect," Aurora agreed, leaning into him. "Everything is perfect." The rest of the winter passed in a blur of happiness. Xavier and Aurora settled into their new reality as a couple with surprising ease. They worked together during the day and held each other at night. Xavier taught Aurora to shoot, patiently correcting her stance and her aim until she could hit a target more often than not. Aurora taught Xavier to laugh again, to see joy in small things, to open up and share his feelings instead of keeping everything locked inside. They talked about the future sometimes, about what would happen when spring came. Aurora was adamant that she wanted to stay, but Xavier worried about the practicalities. His cabin was remote and isolated, and while he had a good life, it was a hard one. Aurora insisted she did not care, that she would rather face hardship with him than comfort anywhere else. "Besides," she pointed out one evening, "I grew up on a ranch. I know hard work. I am not some delicate flower who will wilt at the first sign of difficulty." "I know that," Xavier said, pulling her close. "I just want to make sure you have really thought this through. There will be times when we are snowed in for weeks, times when supplies run low, times when I have to leave you alone for days while I check my trap lines. It is not an easy life." "Nothing worth having is easy," Aurora replied. "And you are worth everything to me." Xavier kissed her then, slow and deep, and Aurora knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. This mountain, this cabin, this man, they were her future now. In early March, reality came crashing back in an unexpected way. Xavier had gone out to check his traps, leaving Aurora alone in the cabin. She was baking bread when she heard horses outside. Her blood ran cold. Xavier never rode horses. He walked everywhere on foot. And he was not supposed to be back for hours. She grabbed the rifle Xavier had taught her to shoot and moved to the window. 3 men on horseback were approaching the cabin, and even from a distance, Aurora could tell they were rough types. Her heart began to pound. Had Silas's men finally found her, the men dismounted and one of them pounded on the door. "We know someone is in there. Saw smoke from the chimney. Come on out now." Aurora's hands shook as she cocked the rifle. She positioned herself behind the table, the gun aimed at the door. "State your business," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "Looking for a woman," the man called back. "Dark hair, green eyes, name of Aurora Miller. We have been tracking her since January. Her intended husband is real worried about her." "There is no one here by that name," Aurora called back, her finger on the trigger. "Now, that is interesting," the man said, and Aurora could hear the smirk in his voice. "Because you sure sound like a woman to me, and there are not many women living this high in the mountains. Why do not you just come out and we can talk about this like civilized people?" "Go away," Aurora said, her voice stronger now. "You are not welcome here." "Cannot do that, madam. We have got a job to do. Either you come out or we come in." Aurora heard them moving around outside, heard low voices conferring. She knew she was in serious trouble. Even if she managed to shoot one of them, the other 2 would overpower her before she could reload. She needed Xavier, but he was miles away checking his traps and would not be back until evening. She was trying to figure out her options when she heard a gunshot from outside, then another. There were shouts and the sound of horses screaming and bolting. Aurora ran to the window and saw the most unexpected sight. Xavier was there, but he was not alone. He had a rifle in his hands and there were two other men with him, both armed, both mountain men by the look of them. The three men who had been threatening Aurora were now on the ground, their weapons tossed aside, their hands raised. Xavier approached the cabin door, his face like thunder. "Aurora, are you all right?" he called. "I am fine," she called back, her legs suddenly weak with relief. She set down the rifle and opened the door. Xavier was there in an instant, pulling her into his arms. "I heard the horses and came as fast as I could. Thank God you are safe. Who are these men with you?" Aurora asked, looking at the two strangers who were keeping their guns trained on her pursuers. "This is James and William Porter, brothers who have a cabin about 5 miles south of here," Xavier explained. "We help each other out sometimes. I was near their place checking traps when I heard horses, lots of them, heading this direction. Knew something was wrong, so I got the brothers and we tracked them here." One of the brothers, the older one who Aurora guessed was James, tipped his hat to her. "Madam, glad we got here in time." Xavier turned his attention to the three men on the ground. His expression was cold and dangerous. "You have about 10 seconds to explain why you are threatening this woman before I let my finger slip on this trigger." The man who had done all the talking, a weaselly-looking fellow with a scar across his cheek, spoke up. "We are just trying to bring the lady back to her intended. We are not trying to cause any trouble." "Her intended," Xavier said flatly. "You mean the man she was running from?" "The man who was trying to force her into marriage." "That is not how Mr. Trent tells it," the scarred man said. "He says she is confused, that she does not understand the legal situation." "I understand it perfectly," Aurora said, stepping forward. "Silas Trent manufactured a debt that never existed so he could force me to marry him. When I refused, he used his influence to get a corrupt judge to rule in his favor. I would rather die than marry that man, and I will never go back to Kansas." "Now, madam," the scarred man began, but Xavier cut him off. "Here is what is going to happen," Xavier said, his voice deadly calm. "You three are going to get on your horses and ride away from here. You are going to go back to Kansas and tell Silas Trent that Aurora Miller is dead. Tell him she died in the wilderness. Tell him she was killed by wolves. Tell him whatever you want. But you will never come back here and you will never speak her name again. Because if I ever see any of you within 100 miles of this mountain, I will kill you. Is that clear?" The scarred man looked at Xavier, at the two Porter brothers with their guns still trained on him, and apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. "Crystal clear," he said. "We will tell Mr. Trent the woman is dead." "Good," Xavier said. "Now get out of here before I change my mind about letting you leave." The three men scrambled to their horses and rode off at a gallop, clearly grateful to be leaving with their lives. Xavier watched them go until they disappeared into the trees, then finally lowered his rifle. The Porter brothers did the same. "Thank you," Aurora said, addressing all three men. "I do not know what would have happened if you had not arrived when you did." "Xavier is our friend," James Porter said. "We look out for each other up here, and besides, it is clear those men were up to no good." William Porter, who was younger and quieter than his brother, nodded his agreement. "You all right, Xavier?" he asked. "You look like you are about to kill something." Xavier took a deep breath, visibly trying to calm himself. "I am fine, just angry. Those men could have hurt Aurora." "But they did not," Aurora said gently, touching his arm. "I am fine. Everything is fine." The Porter brothers stayed for coffee and some of Aurora's bread, which they praised enthusiastically. Before they left, James pulled Xavier aside for a private word. Aurora could not hear what they said, but she saw James clap Xavier on the shoulder in a friendly way, and Xavier actually smiled. When the brothers had gone and Aurora and Xavier were alone again, Aurora finally let herself shake. The reality of what had almost happened crashed over her, and she found herself crying great gulping sobs that she could not control. Xavier held her, rocking her gently, murmuring soothing words. "It is over," he said. "They are gone. You are safe. What if they come back?" Aurora asked through her tears. "What if they do not really go back to Kansas?" "They will," Xavier said with certainty. "They were hired guns, not true believers. They have no loyalty to Silas Trent beyond the money he pays them. And right now, telling him you are dead is a lot easier and safer than trying to come back here and face me again." "You were so calm," Aurora said. "So controlled. It was frightening and impressive at the same time." Xavier's expression darkened. "That is the part of me from the war. The part I tried to leave behind. I did not want you to see that side of me." "I am glad I saw it," Aurora said fiercely, "because it means you will protect me, that you will do whatever it takes to keep me safe. There is nothing frightening about that." Xavier held her tighter, his face buried in her hair. "I would do anything for you," he said, his voice muffled. "Anything at all. The thought of losing you, of those men taking you away, it made me realize just how much I love you." Aurora pulled back to look at him, her tears still wet on her face. "Say that again." "I love you," Xavier said clearly. "I love you so much it terrifies me. I never thought I could feel this way again, but you came into my life and changed everything." "I love you too," Aurora said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I love you so much." They kissed then, pouring all their fear and relief and love into that kiss. When they finally pulled apart, Xavier had tears on his own face, the first time Aurora had ever seen him cry. That night, as they lay together in bed, Xavier broached a subject they had been dancing around for weeks. "Marry me," he said suddenly. Aurora's heart skipped. "What? Marry me?" Xavier repeated, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few months, but I also know I want to spend the rest of my life with you. The thought of those men taking you away today made me realize I do not want to waste any more time. Life is too short and too uncertain. Marry me, Aurora. Be my wife." "Yes," Aurora said without hesitation. "Yes, of course I will marry you." Xavier's face broke into a huge smile, the kind of smile Aurora had rarely seen on him, full of joy and hope and love. He kissed her again, and they spent the rest of the night making plans and dreaming about their future together. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. Xavier announced that he needed to go into Virginia City to file some paperwork and arrange for a preacher to come up and marry them. Aurora insisted on going with him, both because she wanted to see the town and because she did not want to be separated from him again so soon. Virginia City was a bustling mining town, far larger and more chaotic than Aurora had expected. The streets were crowded with miners, merchants, gamblers, and all manner of people trying to make their fortune. Xavier kept Aurora close to his side, his hand always on her elbow or the small of her back, protective and possessive. They stopped first at the land office, where Xavier filed a claim on the land his cabin sat on, officially making it his. Then they went to the general store to stock up on supplies. The proprietor, an older man named Hiram Watts, greeted Xavier like an old friend. "Xavier Crawford, as I live and breathe," Hiram said. "Have not seen you since last fall. Figured you might have frozen to death up on that mountain of yours. And who is this lovely lady?" "This is Aurora Miller," Xavier said, and Aurora could hear the pride in his voice. "My fiancée." We are here to arrange our wedding." Hiram's eyebrows shot up. "Well, I will be. Did not think I would ever see the day you brought a woman down from that mountain, let alone one you were planning to marry. Congratulations to you both." They spent the afternoon making arrangements. The town had a circuit preacher who came through once a month, and he was willing to come up to the cabin to perform the ceremony. Xavier also bought Aurora a simple gold wedding band, the only one in the store that was even close to her size. That night, they stayed in a small boarding house, and Aurora got her first taste of what it was like to be with Xavier around other people. He was much more reserved than he was in the cabin, his walls going back up slightly in the face of strangers and noise and chaos. But he never let go of Aurora's hand, and every time she looked at him, she found him watching her with love in his eyes. They returned to the cabin the next day, and 2 weeks later, on a bright April morning when the snow was finally beginning to melt, the preacher arrived along with James and William Porter, who would serve as witnesses. Aurora wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself from fabric Xavier had bought in Virginia City. Xavier wore clean trousers and a pressed shirt, his hair and beard neatly trimmed. The ceremony was short and simple, conducted on the porch of the cabin with the mountains rising behind them. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, and told Xavier he could kiss his bride, Xavier pulled Aurora into his arms and kissed her so thoroughly that the Porter brothers whooped and hollered. After the ceremony, they had a celebration of sorts. Aurora had made a special meal, using some of their precious supplies to create a feast. There was roasted venison, fresh bread, potatoes, carrots, and even a simple cake made with dried apples. The preacher and the Porter brothers ate heartily and drank the whiskey Xavier brought out for the occasion. As the sun set and their guests prepared to leave, James Porter pulled Aurora aside. "You take good care of him," he said quietly. "Xavier is a good man, but he has been alone too long. He needs someone like you." "I will," Aurora promised, "and he takes care of me too. We take care of each other." James nodded, satisfied. That is how it should be. When everyone had gone and Aurora and Xavier were finally alone, Xavier swept her up into his arms and carried her across the threshold of the cabin, both of them laughing. He set her down gently, then cupped her face in his hands. "Aurora Crawford," he said, testing out her new name. "My wife." "Xavier Crawford," Aurora replied. "My husband." They stood there for a long moment, just looking at each other, marveling at how much their lives had changed in such a short time. Less than 4 months ago, Aurora had been running for her life, terrified and alone. Xavier had been isolated and guarded, convinced he would spend the rest of his life alone on his mountain. Now they were married, building a life together, and neither of them could imagine being anywhere else. The months that followed were the happiest of both their lives. Spring turned to summer, and Aurora fell completely in love with the mountain in all its seasons. She learned to identify dozens of different plants, to fish in the cold mountain streams, to help Xavier with his trapping. She planted a garden near the cabin, coaxing vegetables from the rocky soil. Xavier opened up more and more, sharing stories from his past that he had never told anyone. He talked about the war, about the friends he had lost, about the guilt he carried for surviving when so many had not. Aurora listened and held him and helped him see that surviving was not something to feel guilty about. In August, Aurora realized she was pregnant. She was both thrilled and terrified, and when she told Xavier, she watched his face go through a dozen emotions in as many seconds. Finally, he pulled her close and whispered, "A baby. We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Aurora asked, needing to hear him say it. "I am more than happy," Xavier said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am overwhelmed. A year ago, I thought I would die alone on this mountain. Now I have a wife and a baby on the way. It is more than I ever dreamed of." They began preparing for the baby immediately. Xavier built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and carving little animals into the sides. Aurora sewed baby clothes from soft fabric, her hands working steadily even as her belly grew. They talked endlessly about names, about what kind of parents they wanted to be, about the future they were building together. In late winter, during a fierce snowstorm, Aurora went into labor. Xavier had been terrified of this moment for months, afraid something would go wrong with no doctor for miles. But Aurora was strong and brave, and after 12 hours of labor, she delivered a healthy baby boy. Xavier held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face. The baby had a shock of dark hair and pale blue eyes, and Xavier felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "What should we name him?" Aurora asked, exhausted but radiant. Xavier looked at his wife and son, this family he had never expected to have, and said, "Thomas. After your father, so our son will carry his memory." Aurora began crying again, but these were tears of joy. "Thomas Crawford, it is perfect." Raising a baby on a remote mountain was challenging, but Aurora and Xavier worked together to make it work. Xavier took on more of the household tasks, so Aurora could focus on nursing and caring for Thomas. He would walk the floor with the baby for hours when Thomas was fussy, singing old songs and telling stories. As Thomas grew from an infant to a toddler, the cabin filled with laughter and joy in a way it never had before. Xavier found himself smiling constantly, amazed at every new thing his son did. Aurora watched her husband transform from a guarded, isolated man into a loving father, and she fell in love with him all over again. When Thomas was 2 years old, Aurora became pregnant again. This time, she delivered a daughter they named Sarah, after Xavier's mother. Sarah had Aurora's green eyes and Xavier's dark hair, and from the moment she was born, she had her father wrapped around her little finger. The years passed in a blur of happiness. Xavier expanded the cabin, adding 2 small bedrooms for the children. He also built a larger barn for their horses and a chicken coop so they could have fresh eggs. The isolated mountain cabin became a true home, filled with love and laughter and the everyday chaos of family life. When Thomas was 6 and Sarah was 4, they had another son, whom they named James after the Porter brother who had become Xavier's closest friend. The Porter brothers had become like family over the years, stopping by regularly to check on them and share meals. As the children grew older, Xavier and Aurora made sure they were educated. Aurora taught them to read and write, using the books from Xavier's collection and others they ordered from catalogs. Xavier taught them practical skills, how to hunt and fish and survive in the wilderness, but also carpentry and mathematics. He wanted his children to have choices, to be able to make their own way in the world whether they chose to stay on the mountain or venture down into the towns. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Aurora with a trip to Virginia City. They left the children with the Porter brothers and spent 3 days in town, staying in a hotel and eating in restaurants and rediscovering what it was like to be just the 2 of them. On their last night, as they lay together in the hotel bed, Xavier pulled Aurora close. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Aurora asked. "For knocking on my door that day," Xavier said. "For being brave enough to run, for finding me, for staying. For giving me a family and a life I never thought I would have. For loving me even when I was convinced I was unlovable. For everything, really." Aurora kissed him softly. "You saved me too, you know. I was running from one nightmare and you gave me a dream instead. We saved each other." "We did we not?" Xavier said, wonder in his voice. "We really did." As the years continued to pass, Aurora and Xavier watched their children grow into capable, kind young people. Thomas inherited his father's quiet strength and his mother's compassion. Sarah was fierce and independent, with a quick mind and a quicker tongue. James was the peacemaker, always smoothing over conflicts and finding compromise. When Thomas turned 18, he announced his intention to travel east, to see more of the world before deciding where he wanted to make his life. Xavier and Aurora supported his decision, even though it broke their hearts a little to watch him ride away. He promised to write and visit, and he kept that promise faithfully. Sarah chose to stay on the mountain, building her own cabin a few miles from her parents' place. She married one of the Porter brothers' sons, a young man named Daniel, and they started their own family. Aurora delighted in becoming a grandmother, and Xavier discovered that loving grandchildren was somehow even more intense than loving his own children. James, their youngest, split his time between the mountain and Virginia City, where he worked as a carpenter and builder. He brought his parents news of the outside world, of the changes happening as the wild frontier became more civilized. On the morning of their 20th wedding anniversary, Xavier woke before dawn as he always did. He looked over at Aurora, still sleeping peacefully beside him, her dark hair now streaked with silver. In 20 years, she had never stopped being beautiful to him. If anything, she grew more precious with each passing day. He thought about the man he had been when Aurora first knocked on his door, bitter and isolated and convinced that he was better off alone. He thought about all the walls he had built around his heart, walls that Aurora had patiently and lovingly torn down. He thought about the life they had built together, the children they had raised, the love they had shared. Aurora stirred beside him and opened her eyes. "Good morning," she said softly, smiling at him. "Good morning, my love," Xavier replied, pulling her close. "Happy anniversary." 20 years, Aurora marveled. "How did we get so lucky?" "I do not think luck had anything to do with it," Xavier said. "I think we found each other when we both needed it most, and then we chose each other every single day, even when it was hard." "Especially when it was hard," Aurora agreed. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Do you ever regret it? Giving up your solitude, taking on a wife and family, all the responsibility and noise and chaos." Xavier looked at her in genuine surprise. "Never," he said firmly. "Not for a single moment. Before you came, I was not really living, Aurora. I was just existing, just surviving. You taught me how to live again. You and our children, you are everything to me, everything that matters." Aurora felt tears pricking her eyes. Even after 20 years together, Xavier could still make her cry with his words. "I love you so much," she whispered. "More now than even that first day we married." "I love you too," Xavier said. "Always and forever." They lay together as the sun rose over the mountains, the same mountains that had witnessed their first meeting, their wedding, the birth of their children, and every milestone of their life together. Those mountains had seen Xavier Crawford, the isolated and broken soldier, transform into a husband, father, and grandfather. They had seen Aurora Miller, the frightened woman running from a forced marriage, become Aurora Crawford, the strong and capable matriarch of a growing family. Later that day, their children and grandchildren arrived for a celebration. The cabin was once again filled with laughter and love, with the kind of joyful chaos that comes from multiple generations gathering together. Sarah brought food she had prepared. James brought gifts he had bought in town. Thomas, who had returned from his travels and settled in Denver, brought his new wife Ellen to meet the family properly. As Xavier stood on his porch watching his family interact, his heart was so full he thought it might burst. He felt Aurora slip her hand into his, and he squeezed it gently. "We did good, did we not?" she said, echoing his own thoughts. "We did better than good," Xavier replied. "We created something beautiful." As the celebration continued into the evening and the stars came out over the mountains, Xavier thought about all the choices that had led to this moment. Aurora's choice to run, to knock on the door of a stranger's cabin despite her fear. His own choice to open that door, to take a chance on connection instead of staying isolated. Their choice to love each other, to build a life together, to create a family. Every choice had mattered. Every moment had brought them here, to this perfect evening surrounded by the people they loved most in the world. Xavier Crawford had spent 5 years alone on his mountain, convinced that isolation was safety, that walls around his heart would protect him from pain. But Aurora had shown him the truth, that opening your heart meant opening yourself to joy, that love was worth any risk, that connection was what made life worth living. He looked at his wife, his partner in everything, and silently thanked whatever providence had brought her to his door on that cold January day so many years ago. She had knocked with trembling hands, desperate and afraid. He had opened the door and, without realizing it, had opened his carefully guarded heart as well. And in doing so, he had found everything he had ever needed, everything he had not even known he was missing. He had found home, not in a place but in a person. He had found family, not just in blood but in choice and love and commitment. He had found himself again, the parts of him he thought the war had destroyed forever. As the night deepened and their family eventually said their goodbyes, heading back to their own homes, Xavier and Aurora stood together on the porch one more time. The mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky, eternal and unchanging. But everything else had changed, had transformed in the most beautiful way possible. "Ready to go inside?" Aurora asked, leaning her head against Xavier's shoulder. "In a minute," Xavier said. "I just want to stand here with you a little longer." So they stood together in the mountain night, husband and wife, partners and best friends, exactly where they were meant to be. The wild frontier they had known was slowly disappearing, becoming more civilized with each passing year. But here, high in the Montana mountains, in this cabin they had built into a home, their love remained as wild and untamed and fierce as it had been from the beginning. When they finally went inside and Xavier locked the door behind them, he felt the same sense of contentment and peace that he felt every night. This was his life now. Simple, challenging, filled with love and meaning. Aurora was his life. Their children and grandchildren were his life. This mountain home they had created together was his life. And as they prepared for bed, moving through the familiar routine they had perfected over 20 years, Xavier sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. For the trembling knock that had changed everything. For the courage to open the door. For the love that had healed them both and given them a future neither had dared to dream of. The mountain man who had thought he wanted solitude had found something infinitely better. He had found love, real and lasting and transformative. He had found family. He had found purpose. He had found life itself, vibrant and challenging and beautiful, in the person of the frightened woman who had knocked on his door seeking shelter and had instead given him a home. And every day, for the rest of their long and happy lives, Xavier and Aurora chose each other again. Through hard times and easy times, through joy and sorrow, through all the ordinary moments that make up a life, they chose love. They chose connection. They chose each other. It was, Xavier often thought in his later years, the best decision he had ever made. Opening that door, opening his heart, letting Aurora in. Everything good in his life had flowed from that one moment of choice, that one act of courage in the face of fear and loneliness. And so they lived, Xavier and Aurora Crawford, high in the Montana mountains, surrounded by family and love. Their story a testament to the power of second chances, of healing, of love that conquers fear and isolation. They lived fully and loved deeply. And when their time finally came, many years later they went together, hands clasped, hearts still as intertwined as they had been from that first day when she knocked and he opened the door. Their children and grandchildren told their story for generations. The tale of the mountain man and the runaway bride who found each other in the wilderness and built something lasting and true. It became a family legend, a love story for the ages, proof that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings. And in the cabin on the mountain, where their great-great-grandchildren would one day live, there was a sense of peace and love that never quite faded, as if Xavier and Aurora's love had seeped into the very walls and would remain there forever. A blessing on all who came after, a reminder that love, real love, never truly dies. The end.